All right, we are on verse 4. We actually did verses 1 through 3 last time. So let's take a look at chapter 11, verse 4. And this is, chapter 11, like remember, it's kind of an aside from the flow of general thought. It's an aside that the author is taking to give all sorts of examples of faith, or like I call them, the role models of faith. Some people call this chapter Heroes of Faith, where it's all chronological too. So it really is, in a way, kind of walking you through a lot of the stories of the Old Testament. And so in that way, it's a very good kind of summary or cheat sheet if you want to remember what happens in your Old Testament. So for tonight, instead of doing the Bible study, I figured we would just read the entire Old Testament, start to finish. Dave, you want to start for us? No, but let's take a look here. Verse 4 is where we first start getting into some specific people mentioned. And the author here says, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. So does this story, first of all, look familiar to anybody? Do we know the story of Cain and Abel? What happened in Cain and Abel? Don't jump to the ending. Talk to them before that. Everybody knows the end. yeah, exactly.
Abel brought a lamb to be sacrificed to God, and Cain brought wheat or sheaves of wheat, and God accepted Abel's sacrifice, did not accept Cain's.
Correct. And the Bible, so because they were each, Cain was a farmer, all right, and of crops, and Abel was a shepherd, and so he brought one of his firstborn sheep. Cain brought some crops, and God said Abel's offering was acceptable, but Cain's was not. Now, when you read the original description in the book of Genesis, it doesn't give you a whole lot of detail about exactly why that was, except when Cain gets upset, because that's kind of Cain's MO, right? He's got a little bit of a temper on him. And so he got upset. God responded to him by encouraging him to do what is right. So that doesn't give us too many specifics, but it does tell us that something was wrong with the sacrifice. And we know from the whole Old Testament sacrificial system, where there were grain offerings and things, that it wasn't like per se, give me meat, kind of thing. There must have been something else going wrong with Cain's offering. We get a little more insight here into in Hebrews, where it's talking about how Abel brought his offering by faith. And one clue is, like I've got here on the screen, Proverbs 21:27, which says, the sacrifice of the wicked is detestable, how much more so when brought with evil intent. And one recurring theme throughout the Old Testament is we find, and we've talked about this in this class before, God is not concerned with the outward trappings so much as he wants to see the inward heart. So it raises the question of, what was Cain's heart like when he brought that offering? Why was he bringing that offering? Was he bringing it just because it was a sense of obligation? Maybe Eve said, come on, Cain, this is what you're supposed to do, go and do it. Is all right, Mom, the teenager response. Is that what he was doing it, versus maybe Abel was doing it from a sincere heart of gratitude and devotion towards God? Potentially. We don't know for sure, other than we put the pieces of the puzzle together where, clearly when God responded to him and encouraged him to do what is right, well, that seems to suggest that whatever he did to begin with was not right, so something was wrong with it. And then we get in the book of Hebrews, we say that, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering. So there was a faith element to Abel's offering, which perhaps was not there with Cain's. Now, what's interesting is it also talks about... it says that by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. How did Abel die again? I'm trying to blank on that one. Cain killed him. First example of brotherly love. I think this is where Philadelphia gets its name from. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't go there. I don't like Philly. If somebody's watching from Philly, God bless you. Calling it the city of brotherly love is the biggest misnomer in the world. I'm sorry. Well, you did the right thing getting out. All right, I'm just saying.
Stadium that has a jail in it.
Yes, it is. The first football stadium to have a jail. I think they closed it down last season, but it was there for the longest time, and they needed it. I went to the University of Delaware. Delaware, the entire state, is basically just a suburb of Philadelphia. And not the whole state. The bottom of the state is, well, nowhere. But the top of the state is. So I have some feelings about Philly. Anyway, so Abel... This is an interesting little situation that came up here. So we see that Abel was actually commended, right? So Abel did the right thing. Cain did not. And what did Abel get for his efforts? He got killed. He got dead. Deader than a doornail. All right? Isn't that interesting? Right off the bat in the book of Genesis, we see that doing the right thing does not necessarily equal having all the great blessings and comforts of this life. The very first person we see here who does what's right off the bat, and he dies. So that's now. That being said, what we're going to see throughout chapter 11 especially is the point the author is making is encouraging us to have an eternal perspective. If you look at the story of Abel just from that lens of just what happened here on this earth, then you're going to think, man, God, that kind of stunk. Why'd you let that happen, right? But then when you look at it from an internal perspective and realize the benefit that Abel received eternally for his faith, all of a sudden that changes the entire outlook of the story. That's your first taste of it. You're going to see that over and over again in these examples that the author is going to give throughout this chapter. The next one is Enoch. In verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. This is from Genesis chapter 5, not as well known of a story as Cain and Abel are. Has anybody ever heard the story of Enoch before? Yeah, I mean, you may have heard something. It's not a big story. Like I said, it's there in basically 4 verses in Genesis. Enoch is described as, he walked faithfully with God. But in this chapter, chapter 5 of Genesis, it's basically a listing, a series of different people being described, one person after another person after another person. And it's basically going, here's this person and they died. And here's this person and they died. Here's this person and they died. And here's Enoch, and he was taken by God. Not died. All right. There's a contrast with, and literally the word means, it says God took him away, literally would be translated as God translated him, meaning translated like to take elsewhere. And so what Jewish tradition basically said is because Enoch lived so faithfully, God actually chose to bring him directly into heaven without him having to experience death first. And there was one other person in the Bible that was done for, and I was going to ask you if you knew who it was, but then I realized that would be a silly question since I put it on the screen. So if anybody wants to act smart, you can go ahead and say Elijah now. So who was the other one God did this with? There you go. See? Yeah, and that's in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And that's even more clear with Elijah, which is probably why some people look back and say, oh, that must have been what was going on with Enoch. In verse 6, this is a verse you've probably heard before. All right? Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. All right? This is the faith chapter. That's what this is all about. It's all about faith. You want to know what faith is? You want to see how faith can be lived out? Hebrews chapter 11 is where you go. It's one of the most famous chapters, probably the most famous chapter in this book. All right. And here we have this statement that without faith, it is impossible to please God. Now you'll notice that here the author describes faith in 2 different parts. The first thing the author says is that faith requires you to believe that God exists. I mean, that's kind of the foundation necessary. You can't have faith in God if you don't think he's real. All right. I can't have faith in Bill if I don't think Bill is a real person. All right. So the first step is me acknowledging that, yes, Bill, you're real. And now I have faith that you can do X, Y, or Z. Okay. Same thing with God. But is belief that he exists in and of itself enough to meet the definition of faith? I'm sorry, go ahead. No. Has anybody ever, are you familiar with this, I don't have it written down here, but this passage from James chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. Anybody heard that, know what that's referring to? Anybody want to turn to it and read it? It's a fun one.
James chapter 2.
chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. We could do a study just based on faith and bring in all the Bible passages that describe what it is. I think that would be a good study to do, to really take a deep dive into what the Bible means by faith.
Okay.
What's it say?
Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless?
That's one of the main thrusts of chapter 2 of James, is that, we all talk about, faith alone, and yes, and Ephesians says you're saved by your faith, not by your works, and no one can boast. But if you truly have faith, it's going to manifest in works. And what James is also specifically saying here, people say, well, you say you have faith, you believe there's one God, and so just because you say, you go out there and you proclaim there's one God, you think that means you have faith? Guess what? Even the demons know there's only one God, and even the demons believe God exists. If that was enough to mean, if that's all that God meant by faith is just believing that God exists, that would mean all the demons would be saved. Congratulations. I hope you enjoy your eternity with Beelzebub. Okay? I mean, not exact. Obviously, there's an obvious logical disconnect. It's actually a logical technique called reductio ad absurdum, where you take what somebody says and then you show the absurd conclusions that result from it. So what we see here is without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone that comes to believe him must believe he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. All right, earnestly seeking him means, having a relationship with him. Obviously, believing that he exists is the first step to that, but then you have to go beyond that and actually enter into a relationship with him. And the rewards that he's going to give for that are eternal rewards, like we just saw with Abel, not necessarily rewards in this life. Does God give us blessings in this life? Absolutely. Should we be thankful for them? Absolutely. Is that some kind of quid pro quo that we have faith in God, therefore he's going to make you rich? No. You can have your brother hit you over the head with a rock.
The rain falls on the good and
Exactly. Rain falls on everybody. All right? So we've already seen an example where, it does not result in blessings in this life, but the author here is saying, but it does still result in rewards. We just need to keep the right perspective on where those rewards are coming from and when they're coming. And then we move our way. We're continuing through the book of Genesis, and now we are on Noah. We've heard of Noah before, right?
yeah, what's an ark?
Noah built an arky, something like that. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, what was not yet seen? What was he warned about? The flood, right? Yeah, and he hadn't seen it yet. In holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. This is interesting. If you were to look at verse 1 of chapter 11, what's verse 1 of chapter 11 say?
Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, assurance about what we do not see.
An assurance about what we do not see. And here we see in verse 7, the author's reinforcing that, giving an example of Noah, who had faith in something, a promise of God, that he could not see yet. And you're going to see this build, because this is all just showing that is kind of a microcosm of the bigger promise, the eternal promise that God's make, that all these people, you'll see at the end of the chapter, that the kind of the summary here is all these people, they didn't see the fulfillment of God's big eternal promises during their lifetime, but they still continue to live lives of faith. So should we. But what's also interesting is that it says in here that Noah, by his faith, he condemned the world. And that's almost more of a comparison. I mean, imagine has anybody ever, okay, I'll give you a real life example that's going to ruin your worship experience from now on in the sanctuary. If you go to the contemporary service. If you're traditional service, congratulations, your worship is never going to be ruined again. But in the contemporary service, we have what we call our set change, where we swap out the smaller cross for the bigger cross, and we put the white sails on there. And then we have for the liturgical year, we have a drape that we put over the cross that's based on the color of the liturgical year that it is. Well, I went to Joann Fabrics, and I bought all the drapes, and I said, here's the colors that I need, and I get all the colors, right? And then one of those liturgical colors is white, all right? So I got a white drape. At least I thought I got a white drape. It worked out in the end. But you know what happens when you look at that drape by itself and it looks white. I drape it over where those sails are real white. And all of a sudden you see, maybe it's not quite as white as I thought it was, which works out because if it was just as white, you wouldn't even be able to see it, right? It would blend in. That's how I justify it. But it's one of those things where when you hold one thing up next to something else, all of a sudden you can see that maybe it's not as pure and clean as you thought it was, right? Well, same thing with Noah compared to all the other people in his time. And what the author is making a point here is that when Noah was building this ark, even though there was no rain coming, all right, over and over again, year in, year out, he kept doing it, demonstrating his faith. As he was doing that, it's kind of like here in front of everybody is an example of great faith in God compared to everything that's going on around him that we're just going on ignoring God, And so by saying that he's condemning the world because he's showing faith in a world that is not. And when you hold those two things up next to each other, that's a pretty stark difference,
I saw that a little bit, I guess, simpler.
Mm-hmm.
If he did not have faith, he would not have built the ark.
That's true. And
All the people would have been
all the people would be dead, and then God would have had to start over again with a new Adam and a new Eve, I guess, if that's what he wanted to do.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yes, his faith would condemn the world. It was his faith in, I'm going to build the ark.
I'm going to build the ark, which, yeah, that could be. And the thing is, we also remember that no matter what we do, we cannot frustrate God's plan. So let's say that Noah decided, I'm not going to build the ark, he didn't show faith, and God then destroys the entire world. All right. Does that mean that it's all over and done with? No, God can just start over again. He can do what he wants to do. He's God, right? He is God, and we are not. All right. Verse 8. All right. By faith, Abraham. So we're getting later. We're getting toward the end of the book of Genesis now, or at least later in the book of Genesis. We're working our way there. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. All right. I don't know if you're familiar. This is the start of Abraham's story, and we're going to spend several verses here on Abraham because there's a lot to learn from Abraham. But the first example of Abraham's faith is he was comfy and cozy in his little land, and God said, I want you to uproot everything and go to this other land that I'm going to show you. Oh, and by the way, you're not going to have a home or anything. You're going to be living in tents and wandering from one place to another, And what did Abraham do? He went. Okay, God, here we go. All right. So that's the first example. He didn't know what the future held from him. He didn't know what that land had in store for him. All right. Again, faith is the assurance of things not yet seen. If God says he's going to do this for you, even if you can't see it, you do it and you trust in him. And that's why Abraham was showing faith. And what we're going to see is that in the next few verses, chapter 11 is going to hold up Abraham's faith 3 different times. Number one, like we talked about, in moving away from the security he enjoyed in his homeland. But then also when he became a father in his old age, right? He was well past, he and Sarah were not, we'll say, at prime childbearing age at the time. And then when he demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, which is a fun one we'll get to there. And God did promise to give Abraham an inheritance, but that still had a condition. It wasn't just I'm just going to give this to you, all right? It was, I'm going to give this to you if you do what I say and what I'm asking, and you trust me. Remember, we've talked about faith. A good synonym for faith is trust. All right. Verse 9 is what I was talking about before. It said he lived by faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. All right. Even though it was the promised land, and he was told to go there, at no point did Abraham ever build cities. At no point, I think the only land he ever owned in the entire Bible is the land that he bought to bury his wife. All right. So it was the promised land. He was told to go there, but he didn't push anybody out. That was going to come hundreds of years later, all right, before they actually conquered the land. All right, he was a nomad. He moved from place to place, so he lived like a foreigner. He didn't live in a manner that suggested that he owned this land, even though it was something that was promised by God, which again shows you that even though God promised the land, Abraham went through his entire life without seeing the fulfillment of that promise. God promised Abraham descendants greater than the sands on the seashore. Abraham never saw that promise fulfilled during his lifetime, but he still lived his life trusting that it was going to happen because God said it was going to happen. All right? That's faith. Verse 10, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And now we start to get to it. All right? Abraham didn't build any cities while he was there. He didn't need to, because ultimately he was looking forward to another city. He was looking forward to the eternal city, all right, the New Jerusalem, that he knew was part of the promise that God was making to him. All right? And so this is where we first start to see that element of the eternal perspective, that Abraham trusted God, did what God was telling him to do, not because he was expecting to get something in return in the here and now, but because he knew that in the next life, God had made this promise, and that's what he was looking forward to. This is just good advice for perseverance, folks. I mean, this is my big thing when I talk to people about, pain, suffering, things like that we're going through. A lot of the pain and suffering in this world seems unbearable, and a lot of it is absolutely horrible. But it does become somewhat of a different perspective on it when we realize that this life is not all there is. If you were to think that this life is all there is and that our death on this world is the end, then yes, if you got somebody who's going through some horrific circumstances and they last all the way through their death, then relative to their entire existence, that is their entire existence. So you say their entire existence was one of pain and suffering. That's horrible. But if you have an eternal perspective and you realize that the amount of time we spend here on earth is like this compared to the eternity that's going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever, then all of a sudden you're like, why on earth are we so obsessed about this little tiny little part when we got all this here?
Because we're human.
Because we're human, right, exactly. But this is what this chapter is largely trying to get us to do, and giving us examples of people who lived in this, but focused on this. Focus on this part. It's what the author wants you to do. All right, verses 11 and 12. And by faith, even Sarah, yes, we're still in the book of Genesis, Abraham's wife, Sarah, the namesake of my daughter, I might add, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Who's him who made the promise? God, right? So she's considered God faithful because God made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. Now, it is interesting. There are some minor differences to how this verse is translated. If you have a Bible and you're looking at it and it looks different, that's why. Because, we don't have the originals of anything. All right. You reproduce the originals by the plethora of copies that we do have. We have more copies of biblical texts than any other book of ancient antiquity. And you can compare them, and I won't go into the whole art of textual criticism, but there's a way that you can basically use these to figure out what the original said to an astounding degree of accuracy. However, in this particular verse, verse 11, we do have some differences in the manuscripts that we do have and the way they're translated. This one, you'll see, kind of focuses on Sarah, and says, by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age. The NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, though, says, by faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who made the promise. In both of those, that's not just a translational issue. There's different manuscripts. There's different Hebrew. There's some manuscripts that the Hebrew says this. So other manuscripts, the Hebrew says something a little bit different. One focuses on Sarah, one focuses on Abraham. And so you kind of have to make a choice. We don't know for sure which one of those was the original. And so some Bibles include one, some include the other. But the main point is still the same. Whether it's talking about Abraham or whether it's talking about Sarah, he who made the promise is God. And because we know God is faithful, he can't lie, right? We can trust that he will do what he says. Whether it was Abraham or whether it was Sarah, the point was the same. Both of them trusted that they know that God is faithful. They know God can't lie. They know God's going to do what he says he's going to do. So when he says, I'm going to give you a child, then they expressed they were faithful in that. I personally, if I were a betting man, and don't bet on the Bible, don't listen to me in that regard. But if I were going to bet on the Bible, I would think the original one was probably the one that focused on Abraham. Number one, because Well, Sarah didn't really show a whole lot of faith right at first. I mean, she did eventually, but not at first. And also because all the surrounding verses are focused on Abraham. And so it just seems to me, in context, to make more sense for it to be Abraham. But ultimately, it doesn't make a difference which one it is. All right, verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. All right. What were they promised? They were promised the same thing we just talked about with Abraham, right? Abraham was looking forward to that eternal city, that perfect city, all right, that we saw in verse 10. But none of these folks that were listing saw this before they died, or were just taken by God in the case of Enoch, right? They didn't see the fulfillment of that promise, all right? But just like we saw with, we'll say Sarah/Abraham, all right, they knew God was faithful. They lived their life knowing God was faithful. How hard is that to do? I mean, it is hard, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine if you had to live your entire life? We are so blessed at the New Testament that we get to look back on all this, But can you imagine having to live your whole life where somebody just said, let's take a human example. Let's say you got a friend that comes up and said they owe you $20. And they say, oh, don't worry, I'm going to pay you back. Just trust me. A week goes by. They don't pay you back. No, don't worry, I'm going to pay you back. Just trust me. Another month goes by. No, what, you don't trust me? Come on, I said I was going to pay you back. I'm going to pay you back. 25 years go by. Okay? They still haven't paid you back. Are you going to trust them?
They forgot about it by then. You probably did too.
But that is exactly what God was asking of all of these people that are in this chapter. And a lot of them, especially based on the nature of the promise, they had to know they weren't going to see it in their lifetime. But they still, at least in our case, we can say, yes, we have these promises. We might see them in our lifetime. Nobody knows when Jesus is going to come back. He could come back before the end of this Bible study. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't you like Jesus to come back when you're sitting in a Bible study? That'd be so cool. As opposed to when you're yelling at your neighbor for blocking your driveway. That's my biggest fear. Jesus is going to come back at my weakest moment. I'm like, oh, man. 5 minutes ago, I had my Bible open. You couldn't come back then? No. Anyway, yeah.
I have a question, and I think what you said about the New Testament really is wonderful because we do know that he sent his son, and we do know that he died, and we do know that he rose. So we have that wonderful gift. But back then, how did the people, first of all, how did God talk to these people, and how did all the other people believe that God was actually talking to them? Does that make sense?
It does. And if you go all the way back to chapter 1, and I only remember this because I just edited the video for it, it did talk about how, God spoke to the prophets at various times and in various ways. And we talked about how, in some of those ways, God would appear and talk to people through dreams, through visions, sometimes just directly. So how he talked to them it just varied. He did a number of different things. But God also, we have to remember, he was not afraid to give reasons to trust him. Now, you wouldn't necessarily see the fulfillment of the promise, but look at the plagues of Egypt, for example. If you were to look at the book of Exodus and see the way the plagues of Egypt are described, it says, for example, that God was doing them so that the Egyptians would know that he is the one true God. And so it wasn't just, when God performs a miracle, it's not just for the heck of it, he's doing it for a reason, to provide evidence that, hey, I really am God, so you should be listening to me. It's the same thing with Elijah and the prophets of Baal going up on top of Mount Carmel. And I don't know if you know that story. It's one of the funniest ones in the Bible. It's great. You don't think the Bible knows sarcasm? Yeah, it does. That's the one where you've got the prophet. There's a challenge going on. The prophets of Baal are going to offer their sacrifice, and they're going to put their sacrifice, and Elijah's setting up his sacrifice on their altar, and the idea is, we're all going to pray to our God, and we're going to ask them to send down fire, and whichever one does, we'll know that's the one true God. So the prophets of Baal are there, and they are screaming and hollering. They're cutting themselves because that's what they did. They get the blood all over the place. Nothing's happening. No lightning. Nothing's coming down. And then Meanwhile, while this is all going on, Elijah is teasing them. He's just flat out teasing them. He even at one point asked, I kid you not, I don't know how it's actually translated, probably a little bit of but he even asked if Baal is out on the potty right now, and that's why Baal can't be bothered to help him out. Okay? I mean, I love Elijah. You got to love him. All right? And then so what does he do? He goes and he digs a trench around his, covers it in water. All right, in his eyes. So there's no way this is like just arbitrarily lighting it up. He does everything he can to prevent it from lighting on fire. Praise God to send lightning. Boom, lights it on fire. It's a great story. But why did God do that? To show that he was God and Baal was not. So God does provide evidence. Could I tell you every single thing God did in all these cases? No, because the Bible doesn't record it. But we do see enough examples to know that the answer to your question is, one, God spoke to them in various different ways. And why did people come to believe? Probably because God did something to give them reason to. And some people will, and some people still will be stubborn and will not.
Yeah, in Exodus, there's so many evidence, things shown, but in Genesis, it just seems like there was a tremendous amount of faith that was needed by these people.
Yeah, and
Always, but more so even then, because it was so early in the
so early and everything. But what's really interesting about Genesis is there's clearly a lot we're not being told because, we don't need to. That's not the ultimate point. But take, for example, Melchizedek. Remember we talked about Melchizedek? And he's described as a priest of God Most High. How on earth did he become a priest of God Most High? This is one of my first questions when I get up there. It's like you just throw that out there and get everything. He's not part of the storyline we've been following at all. How did that even happen? We don't know, but somehow it must have. So obviously God was working in other ways to communicate with people. He's given us enough to know that he was doing it. As far as how, he just says, you don't need to know that. Just focus on what I want you to focus on, But it's interesting. Melchizedek bugs me. It's a love-hate relationship. All right. So, yeah, we did that already. All right, verses 14 through 16. All right. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. All right. These people were looking forward. When Abraham was called out of his land to go to the promised land, he was looking forward toward the promised land, not back. What happens when you look back and God tells you not to? Anybody remember Lot's wife? Turn to a pillar of salt, right? Because God, pulling him out of Sodom, God said, don't look back. Through the angel said, don't look back. Everybody else was obeying except for Lot's wife. And that's the general consensus, because the Bible doesn't specifically say why she looked back. It just says that she did. But that's the point. Why do we think this? Because you see examples here of the same thing, the same basic teaching throughout the Bible, that looking back is an indication of longing for what God has told you to leave behind. All right? Don't do that. Look forward. Faith is continuing to look forward to the promises of something better that he has in store. All right. Verses 17 and 18. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. All right. Initially, the author of Hebrews, notice, isn't necessarily trying to explain or even justify the test of, hey, go kill your kid. Just pointing out that God said to do it, and Abraham did it. It's in this list of acts of faith, just like everything else we've seen. All right. That being said, the next verse we do get a little bit more detail, and I'm not going to go into it too much here, other than I can encourage you, and I know, Barbara, I think you were part of this class. We did do a class called Cracking Open the Hard Parts of the Bible a few years ago. It is on the YouTube channel if you want to see it, and we did dive deeper into this particular event of how, I think it was the first class. I think it was even session number 1 where we did it, where it's just like, doesn't that seem blatantly unfair? God's telling Abraham to go kill his kid. Well, not so much when you read it in context. Here's your overview, all right? Verse 19 says, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death, all right? Understand this. Abraham did not go up on that mountain expecting to kill his son. Or if he did, he knew that God was going to bring him right back. All right? He did not think his son was going to die. So a lot of people who, what's that?
Also said, through Isaac, you're gonna have all these descendants.
Exactly. Exactly. Because he had faith. Remember what this whole chapter is about, right? God promised Abraham not just that he was going to have all these descendants, but he was going to have them through Isaac. Isaac was still a kid. He didn't have any offspring yet. Because Abraham had faith. To say that Abraham thought Isaac was going to die would be the opposite lesson of what the whole story is about. All right? It would be saying that Abraham did not have faith in that promise from God. The whole point of including the story, and the point of including it here in this chapter of Hebrews, is that Abraham did have faith. And so he knew God wasn't going to kill Isaac because God had already promised to bring offspring through Isaac. You don't need to just believe me based on that reasoning. There's also particular verses that tell us this. This is from Genesis chapter 22. In verse 5, when they're setting out, Abraham's talking to his servants, and he says this, is stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. All right? He expected them both to return. Same thing in verse 8, right after that. Isaac, they're going up the mountain, right? And Isaac's asking Abraham, Dad, you said we're going up for a sacrifice. Where's the lamb? Right? And look how Abraham responds. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Abraham was not just trying to comfort his kid with a noble lie, all right? You can't possibly escape the conclusion that, no, this is really what he meant. This is really what he thought, all right? Because everything else, if you try to say he's just lying to his son, everything else falls apart, all right? The point was he had faith in the promise that God had made him, all right? This was his honest expectation going up there, that somehow, he might not have known how, it was still having faith in things unseen. He didn't know what exactly God was going to do, but he knew that his son was not going to end up dead at the end of this whole thing, all right? All right, verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Oh, this is another great one. Talk about, let's have a whole book on liars and deceivers of the Bible. So a little bit of historical cultural background here, all right? Isaac did give blessing to both of his sons, both to Jacob and to Esau. However, there was a particular blessing called like passing on the birthright, all right, that typically went to the oldest son. And it involved a couple things. It gave that oldest son the right to a double portion of the inheritance, for example. So you would divide however many kids you got. If I got 5 kids, well, I'm going to take my inheritance, I'm actually going to divide it by 6, and my oldest son is going to get 2 portions, whereas everybody else is going to get 1. All right. It also kind of appointed this son as the de facto leader of the family going forward. All right. Well, even though that was the ordinary practice, it wasn't the required practice. A father could decide, I'm not going to give it to the oldest son if he didn't want to. Maybe the oldest son was,
Ne'er-do-well.
a ne'er-do-well. Maybe it was Cain, and so you don't want to do that. So as a practical matter, what would happen is most fathers would wait until later and later in life to do it because they wanted to be sure that their son wasn't going to be a ne'er-do-well, And so what happened, of course, is, Isaac ends up being blind, can't see a thing. With the help of his mother, Jacob gets all the fur and everything all over him because Esau was hairy, he was not. Fools his dad into thinking it's Esau and tricks him into giving him the birthright blessing, all right? Once that birthright blessing was given, it could not be taken away, all right? Now, what that does, and this is another throwback all the way to chapter 1, you may remember that we talked about in chapter 1, verse 6, where Jesus was identified as the firstborn over all creation. And I tried to tell you, that does not necessarily indicate that Jesus came into being at some point in time, because that term being firstborn is really more of it's this birthright terminology, all right? It's talking about this preeminence, or the one with a double portion, the extra portion would be referred to as the firstborn. Even if they weren't necessarily literally the firstborn. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you look at this family after this event happened, Jacob would be considered the firstborn of that family because he's the one that got that blessing, all right? And then verse 21, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on top of his staff. All right, and here's where we start to get, you ever heard of the 12 tribes of Israel? Here's where they come from. All right, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. This is what I did with my kids when we were growing up, to learn the order. We kind of made a little song out of it. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So you learn the sequence. Well, what's interesting here is you see Jacob's son, well, he had 12 sons, right? And the second to youngest was Joseph, and he had a Technicolor dream coat. And he was a really good singer, I understand. You can see him on Broadway to this day. But Jacob didn't bless directly Joseph. He skipped Joseph and blessed Joseph's 2 sons. Well, part of what a lot of people look and say, well, why did he do that? Well, because he was looking forward to the promise, knowing that God had promised to make a great nation out of these descendants. He knew that that was going to come through Joseph, not through the oldest, all right? And so he was just kind of cutting to the chase, skipping over the generation and going to the multiples rather than the single one of his sons. But what's also interesting is the descendants of each of Joseph's sons. He had 12 sons. He had 1 daughter, but he had 12 sons. They became the 12 tribes of Israel. Each of those 12 sons ended up having a whole bunch of kids, all right? So when, for example, we talked about the tribe of Levi, right? All the priests came from the tribe of Levi. Levi was one of his sons, all right? And so anybody, was Jacob, and then Levi, and then Joseph was another one. But what's interesting is you don't today hear about a tribe of Joseph. And the reason you don't hear about a tribe of Joseph is because when they got into the promised land and God's divvying up the land, he still divided it up into 12 portions. But the tribe of Levi didn't get a portion of land of their own because the tribe of Levi was all supposed to work for the temple and be working in religious service, and the rest of the tribes were supposed to support them. All right, so they had what were called cities of refuge here and there, but they were primarily devoted to religious service, not to working particular land. But we had 12 divisions, so what are we going to do? Oh, look, Jacob blessed 2 of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so that's the 2 tribes of Israel that you see. Each of those 2 sons got a separate portion of land. Why? Because Joseph got the birthright. So he got the double portion. This is, again, just using that same birthright mentality. Because Joseph got that blessing, he got, indirectly, he got it through him skipping, actually skipping over Joseph and going straight to his sons. But that blessing went to his line. So he got the double portion. So his 2 sons each became a tribe of Israel to kind of offset the fact that Levi did not get an allotment of the land. All right? So there you go. Now you've learned a little bit of, if you ever wondered, that's something, when I was younger, that's something that puzzled me. It's like, why is there no tribe of Joseph? I don't get it. You're saying that the 12 tribes of Israel came from his descendants. Why is there no tribe of Joseph? That's why. To make up for the fact that Levi didn't get any land allotment. All right, verse 22, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Believe it or not, even though the story of Joseph is in Genesis, we're actually now moving on to the book of Exodus, because this part of what we know about Joseph actually comes in the book of Exodus. Joseph, he was betrayed 1,000,000 times. He became actually a ruler of Egypt. And there was a big drought going throughout the land. He actually, long story short, it's a great story, I encourage you to read it, brought his whole family down to Egypt. So at this point, all the descendants of Abraham aren't even in the promised land anymore. They're in Egypt because otherwise they would all die off. But Joseph knew that God had promised them this land in Israel, what would become Israel, all right? So he knew that they weren't going to stay in Egypt forever. Although he also knew that he might not see that in his lifetime. Again, always looking forward, always looking forward. And so what Joseph did is he actually gave instructions. He said, look, I know one day we're going to be moving out of here and we're going to be moving out to the promised land. I don't want my bones to stay here in Egypt because I'm not an Egyptian. I'm a Hebrew. And so when we move back to the promised land, I want you to take my bones with you and take them to and bury them up there in the promised land. It was another example of faith of Joseph trusting that God was going to do what God was promising he was going to do, even though Joseph wasn't going to see it. Wasn't going to see it happen. You're seeing the recurring theme, and all these examples are looking forward, looking forward, looking forward. Even if you won't see it in your lifetime, you still need to trust God. All right? And now we're really in Exodus, because now we get to Moses. Yay. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Anybody know what that king's edict was? Killing all the male children, because he saw that the Hebrews were growing pretty fast. Well, sure, that's going to happen when God promises to make you into a great nation, right? They were exponentially growing very, very quickly. He was worried about them uprising, and so he said, we've got to do some population control. What better way to do population control than to kill all the male babies? All right, and so that's what he decided to do. Well, Moses' parents hid him for a while, and then eventually did what? Put him in a little basket, floated him down the river, and if you believe the cartoon, Prince of Egypt, there were alligators and everything all over, and it was this big adventure scene. I missed that part in the Bible. But did they know what was going to happen? I mean, first of all, they certainly probably knew what the risk was going to be befalling upon them by disobeying the Pharaoh's edict. They knew that they were putting their own lives in danger by doing it. So this was not people that were obeying God because they thought they were going to get some really good earthly rewards out of this deal. All right. But they also could not have possibly known for sure what was going to happen to Moses, could they? Now, they knew what would happen if they turned him over to Pharaoh. All right. So they knew that that wasn't going to be a good thing. But they certainly couldn't have known exactly what was going to happen, but they were trusting God. Again, looking in the future, looking down the line. But please don't put any babies in baskets and put it down in the Chesapeake Bay. God's not asking you to do that. If anybody thinks God's asking you to do that, let me reassure everyone, no, God is not asking you to do that. All right, verses 24 and 25. All right, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. This is one of another really powerful story that has been made into several movies and everything. Not exactly always accurate. We know that as a baby, he was pulled from that basket in the river. He came to be raised by Pharaoh's daughter. All right, so he was raised as essentially Egyptian royalty. All right, and then we all have turning points in our lives sometimes, don't we? And Moses had his. All right. Walking around, sees an Egyptian guard brutally beating a Hebrew slave. What are you going to do? He had a choice to make. He could embrace his new Egyptian identity and just turn around, go back, live a life of luxury in the palace. But that's not what he chose. All right, he intervened. Actually ended up killing the Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew slave. All right. There was no turning back at that point. Word spread. Pharaoh wanted to have him killed. Moses had to leave. All right. Moses chose to side with his Jewish heritage and the one true God, as opposed to a life of luxury in this physical world. Again, you can see the point here. If Moses was only concerned with the benefits in this life, he would have turned around and gone back into the palace. But he was thinking of something more. All right, he was thinking of something bigger. He was thinking of something more long-term, looking down towards that eternal perspective. And all of those rewards that he could get by being a prince of Egypt paled in comparison to what he was going to get by eternity with God, with the one true God. All right, 26 and 27. He regarded disgrace, this is Moses again still, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. Well, I probably basically just all said all of that stuff that's on that slide. The one interesting thing was where it does say that he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. Does that mean Moses knew the entire plan that was going to come about with Jesus? No. Well, first of all, you got to remember Christ is just a translation of the word Messiah. And so he certainly may have known something about a coming Messiah. Maybe we don't know what God revealed to him. But it's all related. Remember, this is one thing we've seen throughout this entire book, is that everything God was doing in the Old Testament was leading toward what he was going to do in the New. So when you have these people of faith in the Old Testament, ultimately what they're doing is still connected through a chain of causation, a chain of events, to what Christ does later on. All right. So it is ultimately for the sake of Christ, even when they're doing that. All right, verse 28, and we're not going to get through all of them tonight. We'll try to see if we can get at least through verse 30 here, and then that will allow us to do the first discussion question, which was actually based on verse 13. And then next week we'll try to do the last 10 verses in conjunction with chapter 12. All right. So by faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. All right. What is this talking about? What event? It's right there in the Passover, right? The very first Passover. All right. Now we're speaking of those plagues of Egypt. Here we go. Here's the 10th plague, the final plague, right? Where God is saying, hey, I'm going to come through and I'm going to kill the firstborn of everyone unless you're one of my people and you're listening to me and you're going to slaughter a lamb, which was not just for the sake of slaughter. They ate the lamb. It was dinner, okay? You're going to slaughter the lamb and you're going to put its blood on the doorpost. If you put the blood on the doorpost, then my angel will pass over, hence Passover. It's amazing how these names they come up with these names, right? Will pass over that household, and the angel of death will not come in and will not kill the firstborn in that house. Now, let me ask you a question. Was this magic blood? Was it like magic lamb blood that automatically the angel would, when the magic blood was on the doorpost, the angel said, oh, I just can't get through. All of a sudden it's locked. Created some kind of force field on the things? No. There was nothing inherent in the blood itself that prevented the angel from going in there. All right. So could God have said, I'm not going to kill all of your folks even without the blood? Did he need to use the blood? No, he didn't need to, but it was a demonstration of faith. The fact that he was having them do this and they did it showed their faith and their trust in God. The people, by doing it, were trusting. I mean, they were powerless. That blood wasn't going to keep an angel out if that's what the angel was instructed to do. But by doing this, the people were showing faith in God that when he said, hey, you do this and my angel won't come in, then they believed that if they did it, the angel won't come in. All right, it was just another example of showing faith. All right. And verse 29, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. I don't think we always think of this as a matter of faith. Sometimes we just think of this as the climax of an adventure story, right? That, oh, isn't it really cool? Look, they're trapped. Oh, what are they going to do? They can't get away. And then God parts the Red Sea and they're like, yay, let's go through. Let's get away. Put yourself in their shoes for a minute. I mean, think about it. You're walking up to Chesapeake Bay, right? And all of a sudden, it parts right in front of you. Are you going to take that first step? Imagine the terror, frankly, of taking that first step. And the trust that it took in God just to take that step. I don't know about you, but that's pretty scary because water, in my experience, doesn't create solid walls on either side of me, all right? Every step I'd be terrified it was going to cave in on me, all right? So it wasn't just this big Hollywood climax where, yay, we have our escape route, let's run willingly. They had to demonstrate trust in God in even taking that step into the dry riverbed or the dry seabed, right? And so that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to point out here, that even the crossing of the Red Sea was an act of faith. It was an act of trusting God. Did the Egyptians have faith in God when they entered the Red Sea? And what happened? Sayonara, right?
Do you think probably a lot of the people had faith in Moses? Moses had shown them that he was with God.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe at that point they trusted Moses because Moses trusted God?
I think some of them did put their faith more in Moses than God because when times got tough, who'd they go grumbling to, right? They were always grumbling to Moses. And to some extent, that was even Moses' failing. Because you remember, Moses wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because he started having more faith in his stick than he did in God. At one point, God says, get water from the rock. You hit it with the stick and I'll bring water out of it. Moses obeys. He hits it with the stick. He gets water out of it. Great. All is well and good. Another time in the future, people want water. God says, just go speak to the rock and he'll give you water. What's Moses do? He hits it with a stick. God said, I didn't tell you to hit it with a stick. You know, it's not a magic stick. It's like it's not magic blood. You know, that's not the point. That's actually kind of a form of idolatry when you do that. All right. And verse 30, and this is where we'll stop for the night. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. Well, first of all, what's kind of interesting is you notice what the author does not mention. We were just at the parting of the Red Sea, and now all of a sudden we're at the Battle of Jericho. A whole lot happened in between. What about all that? Well, those weren't very good examples of faith at that point in time. As a matter of fact, if you remember back in chapters 3 and 4, the author of Hebrews was making a real big deal about don't be like the Hebrews in the wilderness. Don't be like them, okay? They were not showing faith, all right? So you're not going to include that part of Jewish history in a chapter about great heroes of faith, okay? Because they were not very heroic at that point in time. But this is another one, maybe like the Red Sea, that we look at and say, how are they demonstrating faith just by marching around walls? Well, again, put yourself in their shoes, or in this case, put yourself in the shoes maybe of the people of Jericho while they're watching. What, are they drunk? What the heck are these people doing? They're supposed to be invading, and they're just putting on a parade around. And now on the seventh day, oh, look, they just keep on parading, you know, walking around. It's like, it must have looked darn foolish. And again, does walking around a big stone structure tend to make it fall to the ground? No. So nothing, I mean, by human reasoning, nothing they were doing should have led to the result that God promised them was going to come about. But they did it anyway. All right? Faith is the assurance of things not seen. They didn't see where it was going. They didn't see how God was going to do it. But they trusted that he would because God is faithful. And if God said he was going to do it, God's going to do it.